you have a lot of experience. You've seen a lot of things throughout your career in different countries, continents, if you wish. You've seen a different system, how they operate, how science has been done in different places from different people. And I think your opinion on this would be extremely valuable. So I start this part of the discussion by summarizing some of the most obvious problems that we as life science early scientists, early career scientists see in this kind of field. The most obvious is probably the way how we publish our work, our journal in the journals, our publications. So basically, science is public funded. Scientists do the work. There are institutions that are also publicly funded. All the expensive equipment is basically paid by the taxpayers, right? And then we create our product, which is our article or our patent, right? But let's leave the patent on the side, and we want to communicate it with others. And then we have to publish it in journals that have nothing to do with this kind of activity. However, they gain most financially out of this work. And this activity is coupled then to the funding sources, because if you want to continue your research, you have to have funding. And if you want to have funding, you better have a lot of papers. Not only a lot of papers, but papers in high impact journals. So then we have this kind of a circle that is if you want to say, a vicious circle, right? And I'm curious to hear your opinion on this kind of an issue, and how can we maybe as young individuals that enter in the field can influence it somehow. I know it's hard. I know it's probably impossible. I know that we probably don't have the power and influence to do that, but it would be incredibly useful to hear your opinion on that. And then there is this, because of these problems, right, there is the postdoc crisis, some people refer to it, that people that are very well trained during their PhD, they decide to leave academia just because of this and other factors. The other one that I would like to mention is kind of the fact that there's less position on higher levels. So if you would like to continue in academia, you better be very good and find a tenure track position so that you secure your future. And everything is kind of insecure. You have this temporary contract, 2-3 years, you have to move a lot. And it's a challenging field, right? So by saying that, I don't want to say that science is not good, right? We just talked more than 1.5 hours about how incredible science is, and I'm very fascinated by it. But I think that we can do better as a community. And of course, there are many other problems, smaller or bigger if you wish. Can you please pick up on some of these points and maybe add on something else that,
Yes, so obviously these are two things just as a backdrop to this. First of all, these are tremendously difficult problems. The whole field of science is trying to cope with that. And the second thing to say is that I've been extremely lucky in my career. So I've been lucky to be the way I've been trained. I had fantastic mentors. I've been lucky at the places I've been. So in some sense, I have been fortunate not to have experienced this. But of course, you're quite right that you can see this happening in the field. The one extra problem about the citation, about the papers to point out, is that the danger with these notions of these what Pete Redgrave calls the glam mags of science, as we all know what they are, is that of course we are also guilty of preferring to cite that. So if you look at citations, these days, of course, we can track citation statistics for individual papers very easily, but people tend to treat those works as being more important, not only grant reviewers and tenure reviewers and so forth, but also we as scientists. And so we are definitely we're part of the problem at many different scales. So let's start off with the publication. So you're quite right that publication is sort of a broken system, essentially. And it's even more, in my opinion, it's even more broken in the computer science fields than it is in life sciences. So at least in life sciences, people are still publishing journals. You still have the whole process of journal, like improvements of papers and so forth. In computer science, they're struggling with this, with conferences, essentially, where they have almost replaced journals in many cases. And you have these, and so then you have the way that reviewing works in conferences, the way that paper improvement works with peer reviewing conferences is actually even more broken than it is in life sciences, and that's, I think, the problem which that whole field is also wrestling with as a whole. So I think that the problem we generally face is that the volume of science that is published is huge, and so we all need filtering mechanisms of different sorts, and so we rely on, to some extent, we're relying on journals as doing that filtering, and of course, the incentive of journals themselves is very different from the incentives of scientists associated with these journals, and that again is very different from scientists who are trying to further field. And so there's a lot of money to be made by journal publishers who are fantastically wealthy. Their margins are huge because they're taking advantage essentially of this information gap in a particular way. Now there are society movements there's I was involved at one point with one of them in a sort of minor way, Journal of Machine Learning Research, where a whole bunch of editors from a journal called Machine Learning resigned because we were upset with the publisher at the time. They created a journal which is completely free, so it doesn't have the $2,000 page charge that you see in other journals, and everything can happen for free. So in the end, we're doing all the work, right? So we do the work for the editing, we do the work of the reviewing and so forth. And so there are definitely mechanisms by which that aspect can be improved. And there are models for that, and I think they're getting better. And I think that the small amount of, so there are some of these sort of a little bit more open access sort of publishing schemes and so forth that are going to work that way. So I think that we can see the seeds of how that could be, how that can be changed. But what we need to do then is to move to the case where we are not treating simply where you publish as being important by itself. That relies on us to actually do more work, and that's what there are these principles. I forget the name of it. There's a principle that has been adopted by many universities and many societies that say that they will not use the name of the journal in which you publish in as being of any relevance for making tenure decisions and so forth. And that's an explicit reaction to this. We should be able to, we're scientists, we should be able to take the papers that we see, who are evaluating somebody for a career position, for instance, and say, okay, well, if it's an area that I work in, I should be able to look at this paper and decide, is it a good paper or not? And then if you can't decide that, then that's one of our core missions as a scientist to do that. And there's no reason why we should rely on peer review. And then you have models like eLife, which is, as you know, is trying to change is trying to be a bit iconoclastic in terms of breaking the mold of the way this works. And then it's becoming, with archive and so forth, the dissemination of scientific information is actually much better than it ever was because of things like archive and bioarchive and sci-archive. So these days, you can get access to the literature much more easily than you ever could. The trouble is that now we have, which bits of the literature should you get access to, because it's just so gargantuan. And of course, search engines will help with that a little bit, and doubtless these large language model enhanced search engines will help a little bit there. Will help a little bit there too. But it's just the sheer volume of work. So take a field like dopamine that I work in. There was a time when you could monitor a lot of the literature in a rational way. That's simply impossible, right? The number of papers is just gargantuan, and you just can't keep up. And so then in the end, we rely on it's like it becomes almost back to sort of word of mouth for interesting papers, for interesting things to read, plus then something you might come across, and then something that then if you do a targeted search in a particular area, you can find. So search, the ability of search to work well. So I think that we can disaggregate aspects of this problem, and some of them do seem to have solutions or solutions on the way, and others are much harder. Now, if you look at the field of book publishing, for instance, think how many books are published every year. Also, a very large number of books, and so we have professional reviewers. And so eLife is moving a little bit to that model where you say everything is published, it gets post-reviewed after publication, essentially, and then people provide opinion about it, just like the movie studios produce their movies, and then there are professional critics who criticize that. So we have yet to sort of create that cadre of reviewers, essentially, and like F1000 tried that a little bit to try the faculty of 1000.
I don't know. I'm not aware of it.
It was I assume it still exists actually. I was involved at one point where they wanted to have a large body of people who would write very brief reports on papers, and then they'd say this is a notable paper. Essentially, they were trying to solve this problem. They're not like 20 years old or something like that. In order that because we're all reading papers all the time. And so we could, if we only had a way of capturing what we thought about a paper, at least a good paper, then we could then, instead of just being on Twitter, whoever has the loudest voice on Twitter would be the one that would come up. There would be a way of capturing that insight that people have. The trouble is that then, of course, you read a paper thinking very much from your own perspective. And so does it help me, essentially, rather than is it something which can do? And so, but it might still be interesting. You wrote papers on synaptic plasticity. You read papers on synaptic plasticity. If there was a way way of capturing your insights about those papers in a way that wasn't libelous and was useful to the community, then that would be a very good way of exploiting this information. And that's we don't have that ability yet, and at the moment all we do is using this citation statistics, which is not so good. Anyhow, so I think that's so I think there are I'm optimistic about the little pieces of the nuggets of solutions there, and people really thinking hard about, not me, but other people thinking really hard about how to work on aspects of that. Now, in terms of the postdoc crisis, that's obviously a very difficult area, and I can see this in basically the basic trouble is that we are producing tragically too many people, right, in science for them all to be scientists. So inevitably they're going to be more. So in some sense it should be one in, one out. And I'm guilty of training too many people in a way. And it's been. I've been fantastically lucky to have this wonderful group of postdocs and students in my lab. But I think about it, and I do worry that we are in general training as a community. We are training a lot of people now. Of course. We shouldn't think of not having a scientific career, not having a career in academia as being a failure. There are fantastic jobs outside academia, and a lot of people can see that when you in academia, even if you do get a job, there are jobs where we have the privilege of working for ourselves. But there are some costs that come along with that in terms of the time commitment and so forth, as you all know. So it's definitely not the case that we should think of this. Training is a very good sort of training that can be used in many different ways. And certainly in we're lucky in the computational neuroscience world that a lot of the skills that we have for analyzing data and for building models are exactly the same skills that you need in many other areas in the world, particularly at the moment. And there's some of the AI type skills and so forth are there too. So that is a good thing, but certainly, and I should also say that as a postdoc, I found my postdoc years to be some of the best years of my scientific career because I had the opportunity to go and learn fantastic new things from different places. I did my PhD in Edinburgh, which is a great place, but then I did my first postdoc at the Salk Institute, and suddenly the much bigger world in that sense of American neuroscience was sort of opened up to me. That was a very eye-opening experience, and I did another postdoc in Canada before going back to the States for a couple of years. But the postdoc years, you don't have the constraints of being a student, and I didn't have a family at the time. And so one issue is that all the training is getting much later, so people are much older, and so therefore it's much harder to move. And so I didn't have dependents at the time that I was a postdoc, and I completely understand that that's much easier. That was much easier then, and now you have, particularly in experimental fields. So theory is also sort of fast. People train a bit faster typically in theory because the experiments are easier to run, particularly as computers get faster, they run faster, which is unfortunately not true for mice. So it was easier to move, and it was very, very important to move, and because moving is the way you generate new experiences. So I don't see an easy solution to this problem as a whole, because it's adjusted to how much science should society do, and one of the issues, I guess, in a little bit, I was in an interesting meeting about a year ago where people were saying that it used to be that in sort of neuroscience and computational neuroscience, that there was a lot of funding in this area because people thought of it as being the way to understand intelligence, essentially. Everybody could see that understanding intelligence is very important, and so therefore we should do this. Now that we have these artificial devices which do a good job for themselves, then neuroscience returns to being a regular science. It doesn't have this extra sort of boost on top of it. This is the argument that's being made at this conference. So that will have an effect, and absolutely is going to have an effect in the future on funding in this area. And so I think that's going to understanding how that sort of plays out in our own field is important. But of course, the postdoc issues are much wider than just our own considerations themselves.
That's actually not a trivial opinion that we train too many people, or you guys train too many PhDs. This is indeed the case, and also the university, they produce a lot of bachelor's, masters, and this is kind of a conveyor. Then rather than at some point, I think it's more like the quantity than the quality, and which is have an influence on the whole system, right?
So, of course, we're educators, and so therefore it's very hard for us to say that education is a bad thing.
No.
And the skills that we're training, and then you say, well, are we? And in the UK. There was maybe 15 years ago, there became a big emphasis on transferable skills. The idea was that people said, okay, well, when you're training PhDs, you can't only train the scientific, you can't only train somebody to be the best person in your own lab generating data in this particular way, but in fact there are skills that you learn, that you need to learn, that are useful skills. And I think that is absolutely true. But the issue of how many people should go to university, what sort of apprentice systems you should have, these are things that societies struggle with. And then it used to be the case that getting a university degree as a bachelor's degree was a ticket to, in general, it was a ticket to a better paid job or a job of a different sort. And in fact, you can see in China at the moment, for instance, there's this huge societal problem coming from the fact that there's a lot of unemployment amongst people who are graduates, and so they've expanded the graduate system. Like this has been expanded in many other places too. And the question of whether there are jobs which use the skills appropriately, or whether there's a different sort of skills. So one of the glories of Germany is the apprentice system, in a way that had been sort of lost in, I think in Britain, a number of people have been trying to sort of recreate aspects of that, where there was a alternative route for, which is an extremely highly valued route to extremely important training. But it's not an academic training, it's a different sort of training, which is great, right? We don't all need to have every, to be academics. And so, that then rubs up against issues that you don't want to say, this is a high value degree and this is a low value degree. Like, doing maths is great and doing arts or English is not. Well, that absolutely isn't the case. So understanding how the value, how the change that happens to an individual through the educational process, and how that changes the way that they look at the world, and how that then changes the way that the things that they can then do, and the sorts of potential careers they have, becomes important. And of course, as things like AI take over, start to eat away at white-collar jobs in the way that automation of other sorts of eating away at blue-collar jobs, that is going to become ever more important in the surprisingly near future.
So these were some of the problems that I see as a scientist. What about some of the problems that you see? I mean, you have a totally different perspective. Maybe can you share one of the things that you think is like very important to solve, or important to address somehow in order to improve our work as a scientist?
So I think that to my mind, as a practicing scientist, what I see, the problem I have myself at the moment, in some sense, is actually the size of the literature, right? Just what we were talking about before, that it grows so fast that, the idea that you can be, so we know that it's often at the boundaries between fields that the most interesting discoveries are made. So you can see in as we talked about decision making, right? It was the link between these different fields that things happened. And you have to have a really deep command of the experimental literature to do really good theory, because if you don't understand it, then you can do very abstract theories, but they're not making contact with the data, and then they're not super informed. So as data increases, as the wealth of experimental results increase, and the number of people generating these results increase, then having a synthetic understanding of it, and something we can really encompassing, is something which I struggle to understand myself. How can we let it get to that point? And so, in terms of where the innovations are going to come from, if you want to have this, not only do you have to be really good at understanding one field, you have to understand the interface between these different fields. How do you do training in that way becomes really is really something that we haven't, I think, really solved, and I think that's going to be very important for as we go in the future. And it's really interesting to think about how different new technological innovations will help along those lines. But I think that's if I think in my extremely narrow lens of the problems that I face. Of course, there are many other problems, societal issues that we could talk about as well. But I think that from a science perspective, I think that's the one which I think is most pressing, because it's really how the advances are going to, the best advances are going to happen. As technology changes, suddenly we can ask new questions. We then going to need new methods, and there are methods that are just there that people know about, and how do we make sure that we know about those too? So difficult.
We should probably have some kind of an advanced chat GPTs or whatever that summarize things for us at some point. Right?
There's an interesting article in Nature from Molly Crockett and colleagues, where they were talking about how it is indeed that people might use that, but then what biases come along with those, and also that then we have this sense that we will trust these devices, right? And we have to, because we can't interrogate. We don't have the capacity to interrogate the literature in the way that they do, right? This tireless thing to happily reading everything. And so the dangers of that over trust until because there's no mechanism to make them unbiased in a deep way, and so that becomes an interesting problem in itself.
Indeed. Professor Dayan, thank you very much for your time, for your insights, for the discussion here. It was an incredible pleasure to have you here, and I'm immensely grateful that we had such a great scientist as you at our podcast. Thank you very much once again.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation. It was really a great pleasure to talk to you, and I really enjoyed your questions. Thank you.